Steve and I saw these nautiloid fossils in the Grand Canyon. How do they fit in that overall fossil record?
Well, one of the things I like about natural history museums is they often have dioramas like this, which lay out a whole series of different ecosystems and communities. And in this one, you've got Cambrian and Ordovician and a whole bunch of those weird terms that are in there. And your nautiloids are in here somewhere, right?
Okay.
They were in the Grand Canyon. And so what we're seeing with these is the community structure, the community makeup. What are the animals, what are the plants that are found in some of those layers? And in the Grand Canyon, as well as everywhere else, those layers are stacked on one another in order to form the fossil record of the geological column.
Okay.
And what the fossil record is really those stacks of layers with the communities in them. And we use the fossils like the Post-it notes to figure out where exactly we might happen to be in those layered communities. So the trick is, the real data are these stacks of rocks that have fossils in them. The interpretation is then how those stacks of rocks came to exist, and why is it that some communities of animals in these rocks look the same or different from ones that are below. These dioramas show us what each of those individual communities would have looked like. And from a creation perspective, what I like about this is it gets us the idea of what if we were transitioning from deeper water communities to progressively more and more shallow communities as we go through, because one of the big pictures that we have in the fossil record is that the lower units are dominated by marine organisms, by shells, clams, trilobites, things like that. The higher that you get up, the more terrestrial organisms start showing up. It's as if all the stuff in the ocean is being destroyed, and then eventually the stuff on land starts getting destroyed too. And then sooner or later you get to the end of the flood, and other things are going on after the flood. But big picture-wise, we have this overall shift from lots and lots of marine organisms to transition to some terrestrial to mostly terrestrial, and then the flood is probably done. So one of the things that we can see here is that we've got communities. Right here, we have the Cambrian community, and that is on this side. If you want to think about the Grand Canyon, take the Grand Canyon, tip it sideways. Okay. So you tipped everything sideways. Here's the great unconformity.
All right.
Back over here, those are the granites and the non-fossil bearing rocks. The great unconformity, and then the first thing that we find is this community that has been pulled up and deposited and thrust over the continent and deposited in what's now Arizona. And inside that are things like these predatory critters called anomalocaris. You've got trilobites. There are sponge-like creatures down over here. There's little echinoderms. There's a functional community there. As we move closer to the shore, think of that as a bit of a deep water environment. Moving a little bit closer to the shore, we start getting into a shallow carbonate reef. Okay, and that carbonate reef has got some corals in it. It's got a group of brachiopods. Nautiloids start showing up. Now, they're not the same nautiloids you see in Grand Canyon, but the Grand Canyon does have some other nautiloids. That's the Ordovician group. As we keep moving closer and closer toward shore, we're picking up more and more organisms. So again, more sea scorpions in this case start showing up. We end up with more nautiloids, fish of wide and very odd variety. And as we come closer still, we keep getting just a little bit closer to shore until eventually, once we get into the Mississippian, which for the Grand Canyon has got the nautiloids, but on the other side of the country, when you're in the Appalachians, this is the coal-bearing units. Explaining those coal beds is an interesting trick, because the plants are not like pines and oaks and things like that we see. They're very, very odd, different, even somewhat cylindrical and hollow plants. Some creationists think that this might actually represent a forest that was floating out as kind of a subcontinent-sized mat of vegetation to explain the types of plants that we see making up those coal beds. So by the time we get to something like the Mississippian, we're right near the shore or on the shore and getting terrestrial environments. We're starting to get terrestrial organisms. By the time we're in the Mississippian, we're starting to see amphibians. But curiously, the first evidence that we have of the amphibians isn't the bodies, it's the trackways. And then we start seeing the amphibians themselves. So it looks like they were running away from something, but they get caught and they get buried, and we transition over and we get into the Pennsylvanian, and in this we start seeing the very first reptiles. Again, thinking kind of from the bottom up, what's finally getting buried, we're getting more and more progressive towards the shore, towards the land environments. And once we get past this and in through what's called the Permian, The next group after this that continues on would be the Mesozoic, with the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous, right? The age of dinosaurs. Very terrestrial. There's still marine stuff going on because the waves of the flood are still taking the marine organisms and pushing them onto the continent. But by this time, you're also flooding so much of the continent that the terrestrial animals are being captured and buried and dragged. As we go through this whole thing, and we've got community after community after community after community, right? My evolutionary colleagues look at these as communities over time. For the creationists, though, this isn't communities over time. These are all living at the same time. They're just not living in the same place. And the order that we have in the rock record, from the Great Unconformity on up, shows us a reflection of ecosystems that are being sequentially buried that happen to live at the same time. So this diagram is great because it does take that vertical section of rock and it tips it on its side, exactly how a creationist would look at this, as going deep water to shallow water to the land. And this, I think, is one of the ways that the creationists can take a look at the fossil record, start making testable hypotheses and predictions about what we should find, and make sense of otherwise what seems to be a fairly curious set of data.
So both paradigms are looking at the same fossil record.
Yeah.
The data is the same for both of them.
Yeah. And we're trying to interpret those data in the way that we best can and see which one of these paradigms makes the most sense out of the data. Effectively, this wall right here takes what we just walked through, right, and it takes it vertical because the reality is in the rocks. That's where you find it.
Yeah, this is what we saw in the canyon.
Yeah, the Grand Canyon. Here's the rocks of the continent. Right here are those granites and metamorphic rocks. The black is the Great Unconformity. And then you've got your Cambrian, your Ordovician, your Silurian, your Devonian, and on and up the rock column we go. So really what we're recognizing is that we have these patterns of rocks. Inside those rocks are certain types of fossils. And both paradigms are seeking to come about with an explanation that makes the best sense of all the data. So Del, when you were in the Grand Canyon, you were looking at rocks from this unit.
Okay.
And we call this, you can see at the top there, the Paleozoic rocks. The Paleozoic means ancient life. So in an old Earth view, this is kind of the older life forms of things that are primitive, so to speak. Then above that is another unit. So this is the Paleozoic. Above the Paleozoic is what's called the Mesozoic. It means middle life, and it has the more familiar Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous rocks. So all those dinosaurs that are here in the museum are coming from those rock layers, and those rock layers are located on top of and not in the Grand Canyon, so you didn't see them there. But then on top of the Mesozoic, there's even more rocks. And those are the Cenozoic, means the recent life, and it's called that because it typically has mammals and birds and other things that are more familiar to the world that we live in right now.
Would humans be found then in that top layer?
Yeah, within the rock record, the only place where human fossils are found are actually at the very, very top of the Cenozoic. Now, I have to be honest, from a young Earth creation perspective, my expectation would be that there would be some humans in the flood rocks, because the way I look at things, the Paleozoic are made during the flood. The Mesozoic rocks with the dinosaurs are made during the flood, right? Just other ecosystems that are being destroyed. And then the Cenozoic is probably representing the world that reestablishes itself when the flood is over. So one of the curious things that we find in the Cenozoic is, we've got all of these mammals of different kinds, and early horses, early deer, whales, things like that. And the humans aren't found until the very top. That could be because the humans don't actually go out from the spreading point until much later on. Now, why they're not found in the flood rocks is a more difficult problem for young Earth creationists. It's one of those data points that doesn't seem to cut our way, at least at first blush. Creationists have a variety of different ways in which they might address that. Maybe the human population wasn't very large. Maybe it was concentrated in certain areas that didn't lend themselves to fossilization. Or maybe people, being clever, were able to avoid most of the initial destruction of the flood that built all of this. And most of the next stuff, and so maybe people were capable of escaping. I don't know that any one of those solves it. Maybe a combination does, or maybe we need, other bright minds to come through and give us some ideas, because within science, there's so much we don't know. I mean, whether you're an evolutionist or a creationist, there's so much that we don't know that, I'm itching for more colleagues so that I can have fun conversations.
Right. So we're still trying to answer some of those questions on both paradigms, is that correct?
Yeah. The thing about science is every answer that you get leads you to another 2 or 3 or 4 questions. It's not even just, I got that answer, I got one more question. Usually you have a couple more. And so, discovery is something that is exciting Discovery
Right.
is something that's fun. It's why people go out and collect dinosaur bones. And once they find out, okay, this is what a T-Rex is, but then they start asking, well, how come it's built this way? Or what do you do with the arms? Or how come the head's so big? Or why is the tail this long? Right? Once you get an idea of something overall, but then you get into the more specific questions, in every discipline, things get more interesting
Right.
when you start, really getting down in the
Yeah.
weeds of the
Yeah.
details. And that's where things get fun.
Yeah. Well, Marcus, we've been looking at the details of the fossil record. Let's step back a second and kind of chronologically walk through all of this.
Well, the Bible provides us with important anchor points over which things were going on. We've got the events of Creation Week, the events of the fall, we've got the events of the flood, and the events of the post-flood world. But they're very sketchy details. I mean, when we think about it, all of this history, which spans more than 1,600 years, 1,700 years, is in just about 8 chapters. Right? And most of that is in 1 chapter worth of genealogies that skips through all the time
Right.
until then. So as important as the biblical framework is for us in providing us with key points in which to build our hypotheses and ideas, the only way to get a lot of the answers is to go to the rocks. You've got to go to the fossil record, you've got to go to the rocks, you've got to go to biology, you've got to go to the different disciplines of science to tease out the details that God hasn't seen fit to tell us directly in His Word, because that's not the point of the biblical record. The biblical record's point is to tell us what has happened and why we're in the state that we're in. Why is it that the world is the mess that it is in? Now, the events of creation geologically are really interesting because God's forming the basic materials of the world. The making of the continents. On day 3, we call this the great upheaval, as God raises the land up out of the sea. There must be profound geological activity going on, not only in the formation of rock, but of granites and metamorphic rocks, but also all the erosions creating huge amounts of non-fossil bearing sedimentary rocks. You saw some of those in the Grand Canyon.
Yes, right.
There are sedimentary rocks below the unconformity, but they don't have animal fossils in them. So that makes sense that they would belong in a Creation Week setting.
Do you think this is part of what we read in Peter when he's talking about how God formed the earth by water and through water? So it's almost as if He was using the actions of water in the very beginning.
Yeah, from day 1 in Creation Week, we find that God said He created the heavens and the earth was without form, it was void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, right? It was basically a watery ball of mush that hasn't yet been organized into something that could support life. And so day 2, God separates the waters so that now we have a distinction between atmospheric waters and waters on the earth itself. And day 3, God then pulls the land up out of the waters in order to create continents versus oceans, and finally calls them seas because they're now organized and distinct from the land. So yeah, Peter is definitely pulling back from that in order to get the imagery to remind us that the world was created with water.
Yes.
And that by those waters, as Peter says, the world was then deluged and destroyed. So this gives us a clue. It's one of those few points in the Bible that gives us a little bit of a clue that it's the waters of the world that destroyed the world at the time of the flood, and brought us to a point at the pinnacle of the flood story where it says, and the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days, and only Noah was left and those who were with him on the ark. The world is brought back to the same state at the middle of the flood that it was at the beginning of creation. It's this watery ball of unformedness with chaos going underneath as animals are being destroyed and buried and turned into fossils. But that's part of the whole point. God is resetting the world using Noah as a fresh representative of the human race like Adam. He's preserving the animals. He's not going to remake them. God's not in the business of recreating the world after the flood. So we see the flood narrative pulls a lot from what's going on in Creation Week, but it does so in an interesting way. Mark Twain's rumored to have said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And what we see is a thematic continuity in the Bible between how the world was formed and how it is reshaped by the flood.
Well, are there other clues in that Genesis history that helps us understand exactly how God then destroyed the earth?
Yeah, the first clue comes in Genesis chapter 6, in the prelude to the flood itself, when God says, "Behold, I am going to destroy the earth with the earth." Now, as a geologist, that's tantalizing. I mean, I'm not entirely sure what that phrase means, but God destroying the world with the earth means that the earth is complicit in some way, that God is directing the planet to destroy itself.
So he may not speak in some supernatural way, which he could, but it sounds like he's going to use that which is already there.
That's right. There's certainly a supernatural component to the flood. It wouldn't have happened without God's divine command for this to occur. But nevertheless, God is also using the material components of the earth to do the flood itself. So we don't have some miraculous source of water for the flood. The water for the flood is the same waters that actually we still have around us today. The waters from the ocean were pushed over the continents by a variety of different tectonic activities. Now, tectonics for a geologist is simply a fancy way of saying when rocks move. Rocks of the crust, the continental crust, but also the ocean crust. Over the past couple of decades, creation geologists have been working up and trying to tune a concept called catastrophic plate tectonics. Now, we learn about plate tectonics in high school and maybe in college if you take a class in geology or earth science. And today, the plates, the ocean and the continental crust material, move fairly slowly, a few centimeters a year. But if catastrophic plate tectonics is correct, then the movements of those plates actually was happening very, very quickly and is the mechanism by which the flood occurred.
Do you think that's the first thing that happened?
Yeah, that as the fountains of the great deep broke apart and the windows of heaven were opened, that basically the crust begins to rupture and fracture and break. Plumes of magma start to invade into the area. That vaporizes a lot of water from the ocean, because if these magmas are coming in, hitting the bottom of the ocean, they're over 1,000 degrees centigrade. I mean, they're really, really hot. And that's going to vaporize a bunch of water, which will then kind of cool and radiate some heat out into space and then come back down as rain. And that begins that 40 days and 40 nights of intense rainfall. Now, in Sunday school, we think the flood lasted 40 days and 40 nights. But reading the biblical text, the flood lasts over a year. The 40 days and 40 nights is just the first period of intense rainfall. So we've got a geological clue in Genesis about what's going on. The fountains of the great deep break, the windows of heaven were open, so we have something going on geologically to rupture the planet, and that seems to trigger this massive and unusual rain onto the earth.
So we're not talking about the old nursery rhyme where just all of a sudden water, rain comes down.
Right.
Something horribly wrong, if you want to look at it from the standpoint of the people who are there, is beginning to happen. You're talking about the crust of the earth breaking open, and it's not just water now, you're talking about hot magma coming up.
Hot magma coming up, vaporizing parts of the ocean water, movements of continents at kilometers an hour, a couple of miles per hour. Now, that doesn't seem very fast because you can walk, a couple of miles an hour. But if you're in the North American continent, moving at 4 miles an hour is really devastating. And that North American continent is moving this direction, and the African continent is moving towards the same point. And when those two things hit together, they end up colliding and crumpling and creating mountain belts. So one thing that we have to think about is that the geography of the world before the flood is very different from the geography that we have today. Today we've got North America and South America, and across the Atlantic you've got Europe and Africa and Asia. But the construction of the continents was very different. If this is North America now, and the equator is down over here, when the flood started, North America was actually down here somewhere. My home state of Virginia was in the southern hemisphere near the Tropic of Capricorn. That's a totally different view of the world. So things shifted, rotated, and moved and collided. The reason that we have the Appalachian Mountains and the Scandinavian Highlands and places like the Atlas Mountains in Morocco that are now found on 3 different continents all belong to a single mountain chain that was built when those continents collided. The idea of Pangaea, this large single supercontinent, wasn't the way that God created the world. That was actually a continent that existed and was formed during the flood. And then it broke apart and split away, and the continents moved again at several miles an hour away from one another as the Atlantic Ocean formed for the very first time. There was no Atlantic Ocean. This means that the Garden of Eden wasn't in the ancient Middle East, because the ancient Middle East isn't where it is today. So trying to find it by clues and saying, well, maybe the Tigris and Euphrates point us to where Eden is a fool's errand, because the purpose of the flood, once again, is to destroy the world completely and utterly. You can't find Eden because it's not there.
And that's what Peter tells us, that the Lord destroyed the world. In fact, even speaks of it as a world that was.
Yes.
So you're right. We couldn't find those things because they're no longer there.
Yeah, the geography is completely different. Other mountain belts happen a little bit later on. The Rocky Mountains out where you live are gorgeous and spectacular, and they're huge compared to the Appalachians that I grew up around. But the reason that the Appalachians are so small is because they were eroded during the flood, whereas the Rockies popped up towards the end of the flood and haven't suffered nearly as much erosion. When the Appalachians actually got crushed together, along with the Atlas Mountains and the Scandinavian Highlands, they could have been as big as the Himalayas, but because the waters of the flood kept eroding them as they were coming up, they never made it quite that big. And as the continents move and the waters start to drain away as the flood ends a year after it started, you start to see the major geographic features of the world taking shape. We've got a Gulf of Mexico, we've got the Rocky Mountains, we've got the position of the continents getting close to where they are today. So our ideas about these things get really exciting because they hint us at a past that was so utterly and completely different than our present. I think one of the big distinctions between the conventional view of ancient ages and evolutionary theory and a biblical paradigm in which we're looking at anchor points of biblical history to help guide us is that we've got those as historical markers. Right? That the flood is an event that happened, but not just that the Bible said that it happened, but it also provides us with some understanding of how long it happened after creation. It gives us an idea of about how long it took between the flood and the birth of Abram, for example, which gets us to Israel's history and whatnot. So it's not like you can take the early chapters of Genesis, as some have tried, and said, well, it's just a primeval history that is detached from real history. It's not detached from real history. It's a continuous flow going back through time, and it's one that has singular events, and that's what Peter was helping to remind the Jews at the time that he was writing, that this is a singular event that was so utterly and completely different from everything else. That's why we know that Jesus' return is going to be an actual event that is completely and utterly different from everything else. History builds upon itself, and God does not forget the history that he has done, and he will use his prophets and his apostles to remind us of those histories.